the following, and I quote, "We should not be giving Black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites because their immune system is better than ours." Can you please explain what you meant?
There's a series of studies, I think most of them by Poland, that show that to particular antigens that Blacks have a much stronger reaction. There's differences in reaction to different products by different races.
So I have 17 seconds left. Let me just ask you then. So what different vaccine schedule would you say I should have received? What different vaccine schedule should I have received?
I mean, the Poland article suggests that Blacks need fewer antigens.
This is so dangerous.
You get the same measles vaccine.
Mr. Kennedy, with all due respect, that is so dangerous. Your voice would be a voice that parents would listen to. That is so dangerous. I will be voting against your nomination because your views are dangerous to our state and to our country.
For centuries, there has stood a wide-ranging belief that Black Americans are less susceptible to pain, thus making them the ideal candidates for medical experimentations and the advancement of the medical field as a whole. And this belief, combined with racism and implicit biases, has also led to generations of medical trauma in the Black community. Today, we're going to take a long, hard look through history, investigate, and truly assess how medical racism has impacted the Black community, specifically Black women. I'm André, and this is Redacted History. The idea that Black people have stronger bodies that makes them less susceptible to pain is a lie as old as time. A racist lie that has been perpetuated by medical professionals worldwide for literal centuries. A lie that we can still see manifested in modern day statistics, like the alarming maternal mortality rate of Black women in America. In 1787, a British doctor named Benjamin Moseley published that Black people were able to bear more surgical pain than white people. He stated, "What would be an unsupportable amount of pain to a white person, a Black person could support." He also was on the record stating that, "I have amputated the legs of many Negroes who have held the upper part of the limb themselves." These ideas didn't just stop at surgery and medical procedures. It helped create the idea that Black people didn't feel things, that we were devoid of emotion. Enslaved family members could be sold off into slavery to different plantations with no emotional repercussions. Black enslaved women could be sexually abused, raped, and forcibly impregnated in order to create more Black babies who would eventually further prop up the enslaved workforce. It was all a cycle. A lot of prominent political and medical figures of the time adopted and permitted these harmful narratives. Even Thomas Jefferson, the country's third president, laid pen to paper and forwarded the myth that Black people, although immune to pain, had weak lungs, thus making hard labor a necessity. And non-Black researchers and academics were still publishing these racist facts and beliefs well into the 20th century. In 1986, Frederick L. Hoffman, a German immigrant and statistician for the Prudential Insurance Company of America, published Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. His report basically attributed the health problems of African Americans to being their own fault. He said it was due to genetic inferiority and susceptibility. He stated that our race has a proclivity to disease and death, and these thoughts were so widespread and normal that his 300-page report was published in the then prestigious journal, Publications of the American Economic Association, and was used to deny Black people health care. The medical mistreatment that Black people have experienced in this country is like a pandemic, a healthcare pandemic, and if we are being honest, a pandemic that has affected nobody more than the Black woman. In Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie's grandmother tells her, quote, "The nigger woman is the mule of the world, so far as a eye can see," unquote. Intersectionality, or combination of the Black woman's identity, cannot be ignored or mistaken when discussing any kind of discrimination, because they are always going to have it harder because they are fighting two battles at once. In October 2023, I was completing my doctoral degree in education from the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. And for that degree, I had to write a dissertation study. And for that study, I decided to examine the lived experiences of Black women who had experienced childbirth in North Carolina. And what I found was harrowing, concerning, and surreal. My results were in lockstep with the statistics that I had been reading about in cases that were over 50 years old. I interviewed a cohort of 10 Black women who had all given birth in North Carolina hospitals. They all had different stories and different amounts of kids, but the stories they shared all had a common denominator: medical discrimination and racism being a part of their birthing and postpartum experiences. The overall conclusion: pregnant Black women are treated unfairly in this country by a mile, and the mistreatment doesn't end when they're postpartum. And this mistreatment can also end, and often does, to their lives being ended. The United States maternal death rate grows, and those percentages for Black deaths are growing further and further out of control. And one thing that I used to assist me in my studies was the Heckler Report. Margaret H. Heckler was the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services from 1983 to 1985. Her appointment was one of the shining accomplishments of the Reagan administration, yet no one really talks about her. In 1984, Heckler sent the 1983 Health Report to Congress. This was a detailed report analyzing the health of Americans, and it stated that Americans were healthier than ever and living longer. However, minority Americans were still experiencing a disparity in the burden of death and illnesses. So, in 1985, Heckler released the report of the Secretary's Task Force on Black and Minority Health, commonly referred to as the Heckler Report. The goal of this report, as stated by Secretary Heckler herself, was for us to understand and synthesize the present state of knowledge that contributes to the health disparities that plague Black Americans, Hispanics, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. The Heckler Report concluded that health disparities accounted for 60,000 excess deaths each year, and that 6 causes of death accounted for more than 80% of mortality among Blacks and other minority populations. And perhaps the most significant thing about the Heckler Report is that it was the first time that the United States government had made any significant effort to investigate the health disparities that plagued communities of color. The Heckler Report has been a transformative beacon of change in the healthcare space for the last 40 years. It's why the Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health was created in 1986. The Heckler Report was the catalyst for change that we saw in the form of legislation, funding, conversations, policies, research, and initiatives in the healthcare space. And it was a giant leap forward towards healthcare equity in the United States.
I was very interested in, of course, learning everything about health and healthcare. I had served in Congress for 16 years. I had been a lawyer, but I also had been on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and that was my introduction to health for 16 years. That I was considerably knowledgeable on that subject. I had to learn everything about healthcare in the broader sense. And one of the first things that I did, of course, was to try to read everything possible and gather the data that might be available for the decisions that I was going to have to make. And I was quite shocked when I learned of the disparity in longevity between African Americans and the white population.
But where did these health disparities and attitudes that created them stem from? Well, there isn't just one answer, but there are important answers. Enter J. Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, or so he was so affectionately referred as. Born in 1813 in Lancaster County, South Carolina, James Marion Sims would go on to become perhaps the most famous physician in the world in the 19th century. But how does this happen? Well, it happened off the pain and suffering of enslaved Black women. You see, Sims' claim to fame and medical notoriety began with the development of the first consistently successful operation for the cure of vesiciovaginal fistula, a complication of childbirth in which a hole develops between a woman's bladder and her vagina and leads to constant and uncontrollable urinary incontinence. Surgeons had been trying for literal generations to cure this condition, but had no success. And then comes Marion. Between 1845 and 1849, J. Marion Sims carried out dozens of surgeries on Black enslaved women. Now, this condition that many birthing women of the time were experiencing was incredibly painful and needed to be corrected. But I would say that there could have been other ways for Sims to come to his conclusions and cures without the non-consenting bodies of enslaved black women. These women were property and could not speak for themselves or properly consent. Sims was celebrated for his accomplishments and was dubbed the father of gynecology. He was named president of the American Medical Association in 1876, and in 1880 he was named the president of the American Gynecological Society, and statues were erected in his honor in Montgomery, Alabama, and New York City. His legacy lasted well into the 20th, even 21st century. As recently as the last decade, you can find scholarly articles from very smart people who argue that we should view Sims' accomplishments from a broader, more objective historical lens and context. He helped these women, did he not? Human experimentation of the 1700s and 1800s was a normal thing, right? But my counter argument is that Sims' experimentation using enslaved black bodies with no anesthesia falls into a long line of medical malpractice and racism, just like the Tuskegee experiment and the Henrietta Lacks case. And these experiments being permitted just helps this malpractice go on for even longer and cause more pain and suffering. And Sims wasn't the only medical expert to have these views. Benjamin Rush, who was known as the father of American psychiatry, believed that black people suffered from a medical deficiency called negritude, which was a skin condition akin to leprosy. He also believed that black people suffered from drapetomania, which was a mental illness that made them want to escape slavery, because being enslaved to a black person should be normal, right? It's almost like medical racism is literally embedded in our country's DNA. Montgomery, Alabama, 1972, the Flatwood neighborhood. There lived the Relf family, a black family of 8, a husband, wife, and 6 children. They didn't live in a house, but a makeshift shack in the middle of a field. The black community in this area consisted of people and families and generations that had been run out of the city during the 50s and 60s, which was the tail end of the Great Migration of black people fleeing the Jim Crow South for a better life in the North and out West. At this same time, the agricultural industry that had propped up the Southern economy for so long was now being replaced with mechanization. The cotton was drying up. Things had drastically changed in the South. Between 1910 and 1970, the black American population went from 90% being in the South to less than half. Many of the remaining black people in states like Alabama were relegated to poverty due to their lack of skill and education. The Relfs were living in the Flatwood community in a shanty makeshift home comprised of cardboard boxes. They had no electricity, no running water, and on top of all of that, 3 of the kids, 3 girls, were experiencing major health complications. Katie, who was a teenager, and her 2 little sisters, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice. The youngest girl was born with an automatic amputation due to the umbilical cord being wrapped around her in utero. The parents, Lonnie and Minnie Relf, were both uneducated and illiterate, which was not uncommon for the time. They were forced out of rural Macon County, Alabama, and into the city of Montgomery. This was again the reality of many black people who did not or were not able to flee the South and go elsewhere. It was in 1972 when the Relf family was discovered by Jessie Bly, a black social worker who, upon seeing their state of poverty and health, said that she needed to help. She got them in contact with the Montgomery Housing Authority, which got the family into a 3-bedroom assisted living situation. She got the girls in contact with a pediatrician whose health clinic was sponsored by the Public Health Service, and that may be where their real trouble began. Jessie Bly believed that this one encounter with this specific pediatrician may have put the family on the radar of the family planning clinic that would alter their lives forever. After meeting Bly, the Relf family was heavily steered toward government-funded and administered services, for better or worse. They were given food stamps, a $150 monthly welfare check, and a subsidized apartment in public housing. These services were given by the Office of Economic Opportunity, or the OEO. This was an office created 8 years earlier in 1964 as a government initiative to fight the war on poverty. Government administrators persuaded the Relf sisters to go to the family planning clinic of the Montgomery Community Action Committee, which also was sponsored and controlled by the OEO. You see, the United States government created its own family planning program in 1967 to help poor and unhoused people prevent unwanted births. But was this done with the intention to actually help these people, or no? I'll let you decide. Katie Relf was 15 years old when nurses injected her with Depo-Provera, a contraceptive. Now, Katie most likely had no idea what was going on or what was being injected into her body. She had no idea what the implications were. There were many issues with this. For starters, Katie didn't know what was happening and could not properly consent. Secondly, the drug was not yet FDA approved. Poor Black women and girls in the South were the overwhelming test subjects for this drug under the threat of being stripped of any welfare benefits. It wouldn't be long before Katie's two younger sisters, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice, were also given the drug. And then in 1973, Katie, now 17 and still under the age of consent, was taken back to the family clinic and inserted with an IUD after the FDA terminated the usage of Depo-Provera after it had been linked to cancer in all animals. All of this was horrible. It was horrible at the time and it's terrifying in hindsight. But on June 13th, 1973, it would get even worse. Nurses would show up at the Relf household and inform the mother, Minnie Relf, that the two young girls were needed at the hospital to be administered more shots. They would be taken to the Professional Center Hospital in downtown Montgomery, Alabama, where Minnie would be handed consent and permission papers. She did not know how to read, so she signed the papers with an X. She had the utmost trust in the people that had done so much for her family in terms of giving them money, food, and a place to live. Afterwards, Minnie went home and the children were left under the care of the hospital staff. What happened next was absolutely horrifying. The two young girls were cut open and sterilized against their will and without proper informed consent from their parents. The girls were taken advantage of to the highest degree, period. The forced sterilization of these two young Black girls would change the United States medical history forever. In July 1973, the case Relf vs. Weinberger was filed in a federal district court in Montgomery. The case simply argued that Mary Alice and Minnie Lee, ages 12 and 14 respectively, were forcibly sterilized without consent and robbed of the ability to ever bear children. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of the girls by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Not only did the suit seek justice for the girls, but it also exposed the long-standing practice of forceful sterilization perpetuated by the United States government. The center uncovered that between 100,000 and 150,000 poor people, most of whom were Black, had been forcibly sterilized by the government programs each year. And many of these people were forced to do it under the threat of having their government benefits taken away. The litigations made its way through the courts, and judges determined that doctors could not sterilize patients without informed consent. Why did it take us that long to get to that point? It seems like that would be common sense, but these were the kinds of things that Black people, specifically Black women, were fighting. The case uncovered that at the same exact clinic, 11 other girls had been sterilized, 10 of them Black. The history of forced sterilization in the United States can be traced back to a window of the years between 1907 to 1932. 32 states passed eugenics laws that allowed the sterilization of the insane and feeble-minded, the dependent and the diseased. These were all people that the state deemed incapable of making their own reproductive decisions. Indiana was the first state to formally pass a eugenics law. They wanted anyone who was deemed as unwanted to society to be eligible for forced sterilization. At first, sterilization was focused mostly on men who were seen as sexually deviant in society. But by the 1930s, a tide changed and the targets became primarily women. It was at this time that the idea of sterilization became more focused on if a person was more fit to parent. And we would see this idea get out of control over the course of the next several decades as the fight for women's reproductive rights intensified. By the time the 40s, 50s, and 60s rolled around, we see sterilization being used as a form of population control and eugenics. Paul A. Lombardo, a professor at the Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, said that it really came down to, quote, who was having babies that I don't want my tax dollars going to, unquote. The movement was codified or actually made official back in 1927 when the state of Virginia was permitted by the Supreme Court to sterilize a woman named Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was a woman raised in poverty in Virginia in foster care. She was sexually assaulted by a family member and impregnated. They took the baby and petitioned that Carrie be committed to a mental institution because she was reportedly feeble-minded and epileptic, even though she was neither. It was at this mental hospital where she was sterilized without her consent. Former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. stated scathingly, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind," unquote. He then added, quote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough," unquote. So when you take thoughts like that, hey, these people who are born from unfit people are automatically going to be unfit, you really get into dangerous territory. In the last half century, we've seen many states apologize for this racist and ableist legacy. Vermont state legislators apologized for using forced sterilizations and other practice to reduce populations deemed unfit to have children, including indigenous and mixed race people, people with disabilities, and low-income families. Quote, "For those that were directly impacted, for their descendants, and for all of the communities involved, we cannot undo the trauma that this moment has caused. But we can start by formally acknowledging this dark period in our state's history. Today, we publicly apologize for the legislature's role in ever allowing this to occur," unquote. However, Alabama, the state where the Ralph sisters were forcibly sterilized, has made no effort to apologize. We've talked about the legacy of women's healthcare in America and how it has disproportionately affected Black women. We've talked about the case with the Ralph family, which happened in the 70s. We discussed the work done by Secretary Heckler in the 1980s. But what is happening in current day as it pertains to Black people's health in America? Reports and statistics of racial discrimination and mistreatment remain all too prevalent. Nonprofits, student scholars, government officials all report the same exact thing, and so do the numbers. Incredible levels of implicit biases affect people in our healthcare system the moment they walk through hospital doors. And it doesn't help the way people view and think about the mistreatment of minorities in the healthcare space. And this can differ based on your race. For instance, a study conducted by the Pew Research Center says that Black and white people share very different perspectives on how Black people are treated in America. These different views do not stop at topics like police brutality. Black people and white people have also been found to have different views on topics like healthcare inequalities and the racial wealth gap. In her book, Under the Skin, Linda Villarosa tells the story of Danielle Bailey. This story hits close to home for me because Danielle grew up about 90 minutes from where I grew up in Walnut Cove, North Carolina, a town in Stokes County with a population under 2,000 people. Danielle lived a good life growing up. She would attend North Carolina A&T and would marry her high school sweetheart, Tony. They would go on to have a family and settle on Pine Forest Hall Road near Blues Lake, a body of water that Danielle loved growing up. She spent much of her childhood near this body of water, and as an adult, she lived near it once again, a full circle moment. In 2010, Danielle was 35 years old and suffering agonizing and debilitating migraines. The pain was so much that she could barely walk or turn her head. She was taken to Forsyth Medical Center where doctors discovered a tumor the size of a baseball over her right eye. She was diagnosed with a stage 3 glioblastoma, a very aggressive form of brain cancer, and given no more than 6 months to live. While Danielle was lying in the hospital sick from cancer and recovering from surgery, her childhood friend Carolina Armijo, who was living in DC, began to ponder the reasoning for Danielle's cancer diagnosis. Over time, Caroline had heard of so many Walnut Cove community members contracting cancer. Her mom's cousin died of leukemia. The beloved director of a funeral home passed away from breast cancer. A childhood neighbor who loved to fish in Blues Lake died from a brain tumor. And his best friend also died from brain cancer. And now there was Danielle. The median age of Danielle's specific cancer was 64 years old. And here she was, a 35-year-old non-smoker, non-drinker, on her deathbed. Something wasn't adding up. Caroline decided to do some digging and ran into information from environmental justice groups that discussed coal ash. Each year in the United States, 140 million tons of coal ash pollution are produced by coal plants, with nearly 750 sites around the country storing some form of the substance. 70% of coal ash ponds are located in poor communities, and nearly all of them have leaked into nearby water sources, according to EPA data, disgorging known environmental toxicants into the land and water. Caroline would return to North Carolina and speak to Danielle, who would outlive her original cancer diagnosis but was still struggling to recover and live. She told Danielle that she believed that her cancer may be related to the environmental poisoning from Duke Energy. Caroline was breaking the news to Danielle that the lake she loved for her entire life could actually be what was killing her. She explained that an inspection had found increased elevated levels of radon in the drinking water. Radon is a radioactive gas that causes cancer. A toxicologist who was working for the governor testified and corroborated the findings. Health officials advised Danielle and her family to not take a shower longer than a few minutes, avoid drinking water, and to avoid doing laundry with the water. Danielle would take heed and move her family away from the lake. This crisis actually convinced Danielle to go into environmental advocacy. In 2014, another Duke Energy plant downstream from Walnut Cove spilled nearly 40,000 tons of coal ash and 27 million gallons of wastewater into the Dan River. With all of this new information, Danielle dove into environmental advocacy. She spoke to civil rights activists and told her story at conferences. She would even run for a seat on the Walnut Cove Board of Commissioners and would win the election for this spot on November 5th, 2019. Keep in mind, she was doing all of this while gravely ill. This win was bittersweet because Danielle's condition was deteriorating quickly. She would pass away on December 30th, 2019, 9 years after her original cancer diagnosis. The very next day, on December 31st, 2019, the residents of Walnut Cove finally won the fight against Duke Energy. The company reached a settlement with the State Department of Environmental Quality and agreed to remove 80 million tons of coal ash from around the state. The events from Danielle's story illustrate how the health ailments that routinely plague the Black community are multifaceted and multi-layered. Where you live matters as it pertains to your health status and life expectancy, and Black people are more likely to live in harsher environments. These environments are more likely to be near power plants, bodies of contaminated water, and poorly upkept parts of the city. Black people are less likely to live in areas with trees, which cool the environment, thus making these Black neighborhoods feel the results of climate change and hot temperatures more fiercely. A great example of this is Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River known for its devastating cluster of polluting manufacturers near it that pump chemicals into the air and the water nonstop. And guess who lives near these chemicals? Racism permeates every facet of life in the United States of America, and unfortunately for Black people, specifically Black women, that reality is all the more harsh. Even more harsh when we talk about the medical aspect of racism. We're currently living in times where things are more expensive than ever, including insurance and medical care. The fact of the matter is, Black people are at a major risk, but according to the history of this country, that's nothing new. Until next time, this episode was written, researched, and narrated by André White. The book that really educated me on the subject material for this episode was Under the Skin, The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation by Linda Villarosa. You can find a link to purchase that book in the description below. Also find a link to my dissertation study, which examined the lives of Black women in North Carolina during pregnancy and after pregnancy. You can find the link to that in the description below as well. If you want access to just more materials or just to support the podcast, go over to the Patreon. You could find that linked in the description as well.